I feel extremely honored to be back. In fact, to be back in the same room where I spoke in 2009 on a slightly different topic. I was talking about Rainer Werner Fassbinder and Alexander Kluge and the year 1979 in German cinema. And I was very interested in hearing Paul talk about the general program, and I was thinking maybe I brought the wrong paper, because next week in the Polish city of Gdańsk, I'll be giving a talk which is entitled Agency, Causality and Complexity. So that would have been an alternative paper to give here as well. So I can tell that we have a lot in common, and I too look forward to our discussion, and it's also my great pleasure to be here with Wolfgang Ernst. We nearly met each other a week or two ago in Budapest, and we met many, many years ago at Brown University. So I do feel very welcome here in both intellectual and personal contexts. For nearly 100 years, film theorists have discussed and understood the cinema primarily from the perspective of photography, as material support and necessary ontology, organizing questions and theories around realism and the indexical physical link that ties a photograph to that which it represents. We debated cinema in terms of truth and illusion, of image and representation, and we considered cinema as primarily an ocular dispositif, theorized in terms of projection and transparency, or as a recording dispositif understood in terms of imprint and trace. Traditionally, the genealogies and prehistories that have made possible the invention of cinema have focused on four aspects: the ancient arts of projection. Here you see Prague Castle projected in an attic through a hole in the roof tiles. But here is a more diagrammatic representation of projection. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is the history of photography. That is the history of light-sensitive substances. Here, the very first photograph that we still have. And here, perhaps the first one that really matters, Louis Daguerre's Boulevard du Temple from 1838. So that's the second one. The third one has to do with modern developments in optics, lenses, if you like, telescopes and magnifying glasses. And finally, the peculiarities of human perception when visualizing motion, the so-called persistence of vision. And I emphasize the so-called because it turns out that it doesn't exist. But here you see the spinning disc giving the illusion of motion. Historians of the cinematographic apparatus have added another aspect to, if you like, the necessary conditions for cinema, and that is the monocular representation in perspective that is so prevalent in Western art since the 15th and 16th centuries, which the cinema, that is this projection, monocular perspective, cinema has adopted by constraining the projected image inside a framed rectangle and imitating the famed open window, finestra aperta, of Leon Battista Alberti. Now, it is obvious that with the emergence of digital cinema, such reliance on photography and indeed on projection as a founding genealogy of cinema has become problematic. And it's at that point that I became interested in an archaeology of cinema, because I wanted to discover other narratives of the origins of the moving image that are not necessarily related to photography, and thereby open a debate not focused on this break that opposes the analog and the digital. Now, in my book, The History of cinema or film history as media archaeology, I have tried to rethink the story of origins of cinema, particularly the idea that cinema, as we know it, that is tending towards greater realism and becoming a storytelling medium, that this idea of cinema had somehow become inevitable, as if that was its natural destiny. And this narrative of inevitability is what I wanted to challenge, because it assumes that all these men of so-called genius, who over the centuries have helped to bring about the cinema, and I'll give you a short list. There's Joseph Plateau with a phenakistoscope. There is Edward Muybridge with chronophotography here, famous locomotion. And there is Étienne Jules Marais with his Station Physiologique. There's here you see the Marais version, which is very different from Muybridge, if you see the difference. And then we have the Janssens photographic gun. And of course, we have Edison, Thomas Alva Edison, with a kinetoscope. We have Ottomar Anschutz with the electric fast viewer. We have Georges Demeny and many others. There's another Georges Demeny, the lip syncing. We have William K. Dixon and others. But all those, whether they knew it or not, that is, wittingly and unwittingly, they became messengers, mediators, or merely tools meant to further the inescapable invention of the cinema by the Lumière brothers. And that is certainly the French version of this history, the inevitability leading to the grands hommes de la France. And this despite the technological diversity of these men's inventions. You saw some of those, very different apparati, and despite of what they themselves thought they were inventing, or the practical goals they were pursuing. All this has been folded into this linear inevitability of the emergence of cinema as the Lumières finally realized it. So, in fact, one could argue that the main purpose of cinema as media archaeology is simply to do away with the very notion of predecessors and to break open this linearity of the history of cinema with its many false teleologies. The false teleologies include from chronophotography to cinematography, from silent to sound. As you may know, it was Edison who actually invented the kinetoscope to complement his phonograph. And here he looks as if he's already having an iPod with earphones. So nothing new under the sun. So that is one. From silent to sound is a false teleology. From black and white to color is a false teleology. Yeah, you can just about see it. Your screen seems to be all pink and mauve. Mine is slightly different in the coloring, but you get the point. Oh yeah. No, that's even more. No, mine is very different, but never mind. These are all very different colors. You see, this is a stencil. Now I give you a short lesson. This is a stenciled colored image from 1900, but what you have is a tinted one, which is a technology that's slightly later. But nonetheless, these are both ways that early cinema was, of course, also in color, and so the notion from black and white to color is a false teleology. The same thing goes from two-dimensional to three-dimensional, because by now we all know that there was stereoscopy, or here this is a stereo photo apparatus used by Charcot for his hysterics. But the term media archaeology itself denotes different things to different practitioners. What is it that holds the approaches of the media archaeology together? What justifies the term, ask Erkki Huhtamo and Jussi Parikka in their book, in which both Wolfgang and I have a chapter. And they speculate, I quote, discontent with canonized narratives of media culture and something not right? It's all right. We'll just have our pink glasses on for tonight.
It was displaying properly. Okay.
It's all right. Thank you. The answer that they give to what holds all these approaches together is discontent with canonized narratives of media culture and history may be the clearest common driving force, basically what I said earlier on. For Siegfried Zielinski, one of the very first to define or use media archaeology is an activity, eine Tätigkeit, that conducts, I quote, probes into the strata of stories that make up the history of the media and a pragmatic perspective that seeks to dig out secret paths into history which might help us to find our way into the future. So you go back to the past in order to find another path to the future, as if you had to dig yourself through a tunnel or something away from the present, subterranean links that go from the past to the future. Or, quote another relatively well-known practitioner called Gert Lovink, media archaeology is reading history against the grain. It is a hermeneutic reading of the new against the grain of the past rather than telling of the histories of technologies from the past to the present, emphasizing non-linearity. For Laurie Emerson, media archaeology provides a sobering conceptual friction to the current culture of the new that dominates contemporary computing. Friction is important because that you can translate into media archaeology is like a brake, an emergency brake that creates friction to a forward, restless movement. While Jussi Parikka argues that, quote, media archaeology sees media cultures as sedimented and layered, they are folds of time and materiality where the past might be suddenly discovered anew. And finally, Huhtamo and Parikka, from their introduction, say, media archaeologists have begun to construct alternative histories of the suppressed, the neglected, and the forgotten, which do not point to the present media cultural condition as their perfection. More or less saying what I said about the inevitability thesis to disrupt that particular one. And they go on, dead ends, losers, and inventions that never made it into a material product have also important stories to tell. In other words, media archaeology might be said, it is the history of the losers, and if you know your Walter Benjamin, you know that his famous dictum is, history is always written by the winners. So this is a counter-history of the losers. I'm not entirely agree with that, but it's an interesting thought that again uses the negative, the neglected, the apparently unsuccessful. I usually say media archaeology is forgetting about the fathers and going to the grandfathers. As for myself, I'm less concerned with answering what is media archaeology and more interested in why media archaeology now? Why are we now so interested in media archaeology? Which is to say that I'm inclined to see media archaeology as a symptom rather than as a method, as a placeholder rather than as an autonomous research program, a response to various kinds of crises rather than a breakthrough innovative discipline. And finally, I worry whether media archaeology is itself an ideology rather than a way of generating or securing new kinds of knowledge. So this would be the challenge that I'm also presenting here as a way of perhaps getting a fruitful discussion going. But first to some of the positive features of media archaeology, as many of those whom I now quoted, and of course I do include Wolfgang Ernst, have been identifying. What a film history as media archaeology, my particular angle, can highlight, for instance, are a number of tensions and contradictions embedded in cinema as we know it, which a shift of attention can resituate these tensions and contradictions or even resolve, but has to do it within an enlarged context and within an extended time frame. One such inherent tension, for instance, is the very setup of the cinematic apparatus in a normal movie theater. It stems from the fact that the light emanating from the movie projector or a beamer extends and scatters over a wide area. In other words, it fills the given space in varying degrees of density and intensity. However, in order to achieve an image, this light has to be reabsorbed by a black surround and a rectangular frame, thus countering the scatter effect by bundling the light and redirecting it towards the carefully delimited part of the overall space, that is, it has to create the white screen. But with screens today often so large that the image actually or potentially exceeds the human field of vision, this constraint inherent in the traditional cinema screen loses its normative status and becomes much more noticeable as actually no more than a historical convention intended precisely to hide this contradiction of the scattering and the bundling. Furthermore, such unbounded or unframed images projected, now thanks to a technology that was first developed for anti-aircraft searchlights, is now possible to be projected on any surface whatsoever, which then opens up the possibility of retroactively returning to a long-standing practice among the arts of projection that appear to have become obsolete with the arrival of cinema, namely the phantasmagorias of the late 18th and 19th century of, among others, Paul Philidor and Etienne Gaspard Robertson, one a Frenchman, the other one a Belgian. This practice, which was once so prevalent and popular, and indeed turns up as a highly significant metaphor in Georg Wilhelm Hegel's philosophy of spirit, has been known to historians, film historians, but it has only achieved the status of a neglected tradition of interest to media archaeologists, since our own visual environment once more resembles, in some aspects, phantasmagoric spectacles, that is, visual displays that fill the space rather than be focused and bounded in this rectangle. And this new form of filling the space is used by artists, as in the work of Krzysztof Wodiczko, projecting here a pair of soldiers' boots on the tower, the Campanile in Venice, St. Mark's Square, or Doug Aitken. This is outside the MoMA in New York, or quite famously now Anthony McCall with his line describing a cone. So projection has, as it were, liberated itself from the rectangular frame, and thereby putting the rectangular frame no longer as the norm, but almost as a subcategory of projection. Another tension that is also not unknown but often ignored is how the cinema inscribes itself in the long history of making images mobile and portable, which takes us back to Renaissance Italy and the secularization of image making and the establishment of a market for pictures, in the way that other goods are now manufactured on demand and then marketed. For instance, the move from fresco walls to oil painting is a very complex historical process with far-reaching consequences. which among other things proves that such transitions and transformations are neither linear nor gradual. They can be quite sudden, and as I will try to show, they're very rarely linear. One simple point to make is that a mobile picture can indeed become a commodity. It can be bought and sold, it can be traded and transported, it can be owned and displayed in ways and in places quite different from a mural commissioned by a monastery or painted in a church. This process of mobility and portability affects both size and subject matter, but it also determines the mode of representation and made special sense of monocular perspective. As soon as images became mobile, monocular perspective came in, and I think it has a correlation. Those two have a correlation, mobility and monocular perspective, because it reinforced the spectator's single point of view as if to now anchor the image via the sight lines and no longer the sight specificity, and as if to compensate for the picture's sudden mobility and its variability in physical space, you find a representational code that fixes it again. Now, photography is, of course, the medium that has most decisively intensified these, if you like, economic aspects of image making and image trading. This you will recognize is André Malraux and the Musée Imaginaire, where he retells the history of art through photography, and it's a very deliberate decision that he makes to use photographs and changes scale of the objects that are being photographed. I mean, there's a whole history that, we could talk for hours about, that particular intervention that André Malraux made in the 40s. But the point that I want to just make now is that, as I said, that photography is the medium that has accelerated and intensified these economic aspects of image making and image trading, as well as different forms of exchange between mechanical images and mass-produced objects in the forms of commodities. This is a shot from Jean-Luc Godard's Les Carabiniers from 1963, where the two male protagonists come back from war, and their women say, "What have you brought us back? What have you conquered?" And they open a suitcase with postcards. So it's Godard's ironic and witty reinterpretation of that process of turning objects into images and images into commodities, because they think they now own these images. I'll come back to that because I think it has interesting implications for today as well. So cinema as a photographic medium was able to inherit and to exploit both the traditions, that of wall paintings or murals in terms of size, but also that of miniature and oil painting. The first way that images became mobile, if you like. And indeed, as you probably know, Henry VIII married his women, of whom there were quite a few, by getting his court painter Hans Holbein to go to France and take pictures of beautiful princesses. And this is what he then sent back. This is not exactly one of those, but you get the point, that the mobility was already a very important aspect of trading, in this case, trading women. So the cinema, I'm arguing, as a photographic medium, inherits both the site specificity or the illusion of site specificity of murals, but also of miniatures and so on, the portability and close-up and what have you. So it combines the advantages of size and extension provided by an image wall with a framed and centered view of oil painting, as well as the attention to detail and close-up inherent first in the miniature and later in the photograph. Yet while getting the best of all possible image worlds, the cinema also embedded another tension in its dispositif, so that the different parameters of fixed spectator and mobile image, this is how we know it in the cinema, or the focused gaze and the wandering eye, what I just talked about, had to be renegotiated and played off against each other when the moving image left the cinema relocated in different spaces, like small screens, but also relocated into the gallery space. Because there, where you have the peripatetic spectator, there you have a different correlation between fixed spectator and mobile image. They become relational to each other. So we became much more aware of these parameters of fixed and mobile. So, for instance, a video installation by an artist like Bill Viola can, as it were, rediscover the drama of Christ's resurrection here in a new idiom, but also using the forms, if you like, the spatial forms of an altarpiece from a Gothic cathedral, or reinvent the interior of Giotto's Scrovegni chapel in Padua for his installation Going Forth by Day, which was first shown in 2002 at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. So you see here the one was a Scrovegni chapel, and there you see the layout of Bill Viola's triptych, or 4 screens actually. By a paradox that perhaps only the media archaeologist can fully appreciate, contemporary art is rediscovering the unique aesthetic value of location and site specificity, which artists sacrificed at the point in time when images did become secular and the need to create a market required this aforementioned mobility. Patrons and site specificity is one parameter versus market, patrons, that is, people who commission it for their own private use or for the church, versus market and mobility. These would be some of the transhistorical variables when it comes to the status of images. So again, no from to, but a variability of transhistorical concerns and possibilities. Again, part of my argument against linearity. The increased mobility and circulation argument about images since the invention of easel painting, and thus their close alignment with commodities which can be traded, owned, and possessed, is a thesis advanced also implicitly by Guy Debord in his Society of the Spectacle. And similar reflections can be found in Frederick Jameson or in John Burgess' Ways of Seeing, a book from the 70s that was hugely influential for both media scholars and art historians. What this means for a genealogy of the cinema is that the circulation and mobility of images in the form of framed pictures turns them into physical objects, while the material objects depicted become immaterial representations. So another trade-off between material and immaterial. A move often commented on in connection with Dutch still life. That is the so-called pronk pictures of the 1660s to the 1690s, where food and precious objects are arranged and displayed in ways that shop windows were to exhibit luxury goods in the grand department stores on the boulevards of Paris or New York in the 1900s. So we have a 200-year gap where the cinema around 1900 would be taking up this Dutch art of transubstantiation, I call it, by remediating it from painting, photography in the shop window, to film, tableau, and a moving image. This is one way in which cinema has been, in the context of cultural studies, connected to shop displays, consumption, and consumer culture. Indeed, cinema would thus not only be a storytelling medium, but function also as a mediator that prepares and reshapes the physical world as image, as picture, as spectacle, in a process that only intensified and accelerated throughout the 20th century. It really is a shame that the screen doesn't give you the lush intensity of these textures and shapes. Yes, well, I think not too far from, maybe you have a few museums here as well. Otherwise, you'll have to go to the Prado in Madrid. Anyway, So it would not only be a storytelling medium. Remember I said this inevitability narrative is so closely linked to storytelling, and I'm saying no, it doesn't have to be that way. It prepares and reshapes the physical world as image, picture, and spectacle in a process that only intensified and accelerated throughout the 20th century. And indeed it led a political filmmaker like Harun Farocki to concede that even his kind of critical documentary cinema inevitably contributed to what he calls making the world superfluous, because images absorb the real in the very act of representing and documenting the real. You only have to think of beautiful spaces that now get photographed so much that they have to reshape themselves in the image of the expectations that the tourists have of them. So there is this transubstantiation going on, and I think the cinema has had an extremely important and not always beneficial role in this, but it shows that if we expand the time frame to something like 500 years, or Siegfried Zielinski would say 5,000 years, and on the other hand, we expand the range of what we think the cinema drew from or impacted on. Now, in this linear narrative that I've just sketched, from fresco wall and mural to oil painting, from easel painting, there we have a studio where the easel first comes to be seen, but you also see all the other people that are involved in making pictures into commodities, framing them, printing them, copying them, and so on. There, it's just a summary of my argument, but one of the key aspects, of course, is making painting mobile by mobile easels, but also by paint that you could put in tubes rather than have to mix in your little pot. So all this is these are part of a history that, or a genealogy that I'm drawing on. So because from portable easel we come to portable photographic camera, and from portable photographic camera to indeed the cinematograph that is so superior, or was deemed to be so superior to Edison's invention, precisely by being mobile and having both recording and projection capabilities in one apparatus. So what we note in this narrative is indeed the mobility of the image and the automation of its registration, but at the same time, holding mobility in check is that what I call the single point of view, subjected and directed by the rules of monocular representation. So insofar as we now persist in associating cinema with this Renaissance model of perception and argue that this single point of view reinforces both bourgeois individualism and a strict subject-object division, or a subjectification, as does the theory of the cinematic apparatus, we may have little choice but to declare the cinema to be based on an unresolved contradiction which has predestined to becoming obsolete. So we really have to say, yes, this kind of cinema is probably obsolete. Now, the reason often given for this obsolescence is that our contemporary media landscape, multiple screens, both big and small, both indoors and in the open, and our contemporary media use, watching movies on our smartphones, etc., using YouTube as our video store, encourages us, indeed obliges us, to adopt multiple points of view, to be multitasking and to be flexible both in our object relations and in our forms of subjectification. To be held in thrall by the double geometry of linear narrative and monocular perspective is now experienced quite openly as an arbitrary constraint. But as I tried to show, that arbitrary constraint has always been there, merely by the fact that other modes of interacting with moving images have become so readily available in terms of their technologies and have found so little resistance in becoming habitual and commonplace. There has virtually been, while we see a huge rupture between analog and digital, the common consumer hasn't noticed it at all. That's one of the paradoxes of the topics that we're interested in from a philosophical point of view. But this effectively having to admit that the cinema has become obsolete, or as people say, the death of cinema, And indeed, there are a lot of people, and some of them you probably read, like Jacques Aumont or Raymond Bellour, who actually do draw a line and say what we have now is not cinema, because they keep to some of those parameters. They not always make them explicit as I make them, and they certainly don't admit to them being historically variable, but they insist that the cinema has a narrow definition, and that's the one that they are primarily interested in. Yet I don't think this is the only conclusion one can reach. There are ways of thinking about cinema outside the constraints of the cinematic apparatus and past the apparent blockage that the ontology of the photographic image has created for this, what we now call post-photographic cinema. For instance, in what might seem to be a counterintuitive and even counterfactual move, one can enlist even André Bazin. Well, here I've got some more about the André, yeah. Here are images. I'll just go through them very briefly because they happen to be in my PowerPoint. There's another argument which I'm not going to be making, and maybe Wolfgang Ernst will make it. If you go back to the late 19th century and you look at what people in the 19th century thought was their future, what did they imagine would be the technologies that they wanted to have, you will see that these are not the cinema. They are much more like domestic appliances. They are much more something that is interactive. You see, the man in the chair is actually talking to the woman on the screen. Here again, this interactivity. Or here you have, from the 1870s, something that we now say, oh, this is Skype. And so the notion has now arisen that not only is the cinema dead and obsolete, the cinema was a dead end. The cinema was the wrong way of going from the 19th century to the 21st century. There are people like Bill Uricchio and to some extent Siegfried Zielinski, I don't know whether Wolfgang Ernst also belongs to those, who actually think that in evolution, the cinema was a mistake. And you see, from a particular perspective, from a media archaeological perspective, you have arguments to actually say, yes, look, here's the evidence. But I want to make a different argument now for the cinema. We actually may have some future for the cinema. And so I go back to the father of film studies, namely André Bazin. I think one can make an argument, Bazin is known primarily for the ontology of the photographic image. This here, Ontologie de l'image photographique. He's also counted amongst the phenomenologists of the cinema, but I now want to reclaim him as a media archaeologist of the cinema, for whom photography was only one possible physical and metaphysical or ontological support. As recent scholarship has shown, there are many more Bazins, and one of them has... I'm now have lost my place a little bit. So Bazin would be one whose arguments for regarding the cinema as part of a very long history of human preoccupation, not so much with realism, but with mortality and death, under the dual heading of preservation and its afterlife. Cinema for Bazin belongs to the same spiritual urge of preservation, but also of anxiety and dread, out of which humans have wanted to preserve the dead, mummifying them, or indeed the Turin shroud of preserving the physical remains, the site specificity of Christ. So Bazin insisted on the cinema's role as trace and index in the way that plaster casts and death masks precede photography and at the same time were continued by photography, even to the point of eventually using the same negative-positive reversal in order to preserve the uncanny likeness of human beings after death. So cinema, defined in this way, is both very ancient and very modern, and therefore, as long as human beings fear and death and wish for an afterlife that is both immanent and tangible, the cinema will persist and survive. Bazin's film history as media archaeology, in other words, makes room for a genealogy that embeds the cinema in a history of opacity and rather than transparency of material objects like an envelope or a cast, rather than identifying it solely with a view to be contemplated and a window on the world. Now I'm notified that my time is up, so what I will do is I will take those 5 minutes, those 3 minutes, and just go through some of the things that I still have on my PowerPoint to show you where I would have taken this argument. I would go back to two kinds of optics. I would make a distinction between geometrical optics and physiological optics. And in the course of this, I would go back to Christian Huygens, who was the first one to actually consider the two theories of light, because I would go back from my actual genealogy of cinema, or media archaeology, to light as the very source. And Christian Huygens is a very interesting character because he was the first one to challenge Newton's theory of particle theory by admitting that there could be a wave theory of light, and he's also the first one to actually draw a workable model of a camera obscura. A magic lantern. Here you go, a magic lantern. But he's also, and you see that, his wave theory of light, that he has a little sketch about that. And that would introduce us to phantasmagoria that I talked about before, but I want to go to something else. And this is where we get to the Hegel in philosophy, or Friedrich Schiller, the Geisterseher. So the technology of phantasmagoria was already seen as a philosophical toy. Both Schiller and Hegel used it in order to think very seriously about the nature of representation and perception. I'll skip all this. I have a long passage on Jonathan Crary, who was the first one to actually talk about physiology of vision in the 19th century, reviving discredited theories like Goethe's Farbenlehre, color theory. But what he comes to, and I go over this as well, and where I talk about waves theories of light in terms of German expressionism. Again, you can't see what the real figures are, all the way to blockbusters. So I have an argument to say that what we now talk about, embedded vision, or the cinema and the senses, or body and cinema, leads us to physiological optics, whereas the cinematic apparatus that I say is now obsolete is geometrical optics. And so what we should do now is perhaps to investigate much more closely the genealogy of physiological optics. And there we come to Helmholtz and his Handbuch, Allgemeine Handbuch der physiologischen Optik. And Helmholtz, I think, and Huygens and Helmholtz, Hermann von Helmholtz, are key figures in when we extend cinema thinking into these new forms of embodiment. Because Helmholtz not only had physiological optics as one of his key interests, but also electromagnetism. And I think if we're looking at blockbusters like today, which are always images without a horizon. There is no frame anymore. I mean, they're made for IMAX, but even if you don't see it in IMAX, the very representational spaces are no longer with a horizon or a frame. We are in those big films, whether that's Avatar, whether that's Gravity, whether that's Life of Pi, or The Revenant, we are in a world that has no boundaries. In other words, that these films want to disorient our perception in such a way that we are bodily involved. They are into physiological optics. Here's the shot of The Revenant, but also what I call Gopro aesthetics, images that are so close that you cannot orient yourself in the imaginary space that the cinema gives you. This is from a film that you may know, Leviathan, about deep-sea fishing, and it's used, these GoPro cameras. It's made by Canadian filmmakers, but it's a product of a Harvard lab. So I will leave it with this image of virtual reality and who owns the virtual reality. Thank you.